Hello, my name is Corey, and I'm a content and support engineer here at Geocodio. And today we're going to continue our tutorial showing you how to build an application using the Geocodio API, where you're going to be able to enter a user's address into a form, and it's going to send a API call to Geocodio and then return information about their congressional district as well as their congressional representatives. This is an awesome little tool that you can use to kind of really see the power of what Geocodio can do. If you haven't checked out part 1 yet, I'm going to go ahead and link that in the description below. But make sure to check that out first, because back in part 1, we discussed building out our Rails backend, and that's really going to be crucial for where we're going to head next. And we can actually take a look at that just to kind of see where we're starting from. Our Rails backend is pretty awesome. Right? We were able to enter an address using our Rails library that we've provided. And when we enter an address, it returns a response from the Geocodio API. We can see all of the information that we requested about the congressional district and the representatives. However, we are very limited in terms of the scope of use of our application right now, right? Because we don't have a front end at all. There's no way for users to interact with it. And also, we've hard-coded an address here. And that's a problem, right? Not everybody lives at 20 West 34th Street. So we are going to want some means in which to take an address from our form here on the front end, and then we're going to want to be able to pass that in to this Geocodio function here, and this will then send us a response to whatever we have entered into the form. I think that's really the next step that we need to go down. So we're going to do this by building out a React front end. I'm also going to use a little bit of Redux because that's where I'm comfortable, but you can just use plain React if you'd like, or whatever is your sort of preferred method of working with React and JavaScript. I think, go ahead and do it, but we're going to focus on a React front end that's going to then connect to our Rails backend. And hopefully by the end of this tutorial, we'll have a fully functioning application that you can use as an example, and that you can really be able to get a chance to kind of play around with and even expand upon if you'd like. So let's go ahead and get started. I think the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to generate our React application and get started on building out that front end. So let's go ahead and get started generating our React application. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a new window in VS Code here. And I'm actually just going to get rid of our backend for a little while. We'll come back to that soon, but we won't need it for at least a little bit here. Now, something just to keep in mind as we get into this, the front end is definitely going to be a bit more complicated than the back end was. So this might be a little bit of a longer tutorial, but we're going to try to make it as brief as possible and try to get this information to you in sort of bite-sized chunks. So if you need to take a break at any point, go ahead and do it. So first, I want to go ahead and I'm going to CD into my Congress search folder, which contains my backend as well. And then I'm going to go ahead and we'll make we'll break a brand new React app. So we're going to use the create React app generator, and I'm going to call it, let's say, Congress tutorial. And then we'll go ahead and get that started. Now, this might take a second here. So something to keep in mind is that, as I said earlier, I'm going to be using Redux as well as React to sort of make it a little bit easier to store my state across multiple components. But you might have a different method. You might have something else you prefer, and you can absolutely do that. It's just where I'm most comfortable. So we're going to let this generate itself, and then I'm going to come back to you in just a second once it's ready. With our React app generated, let's go ahead and CD into that. So it's Congress. I believe I named it. Oh, sorry. Actually, I'm going to use code instead of CD. Let's do code Congress tutorial front end. I think that's what I called it. Let's open that up. Awesome. So we have a very simple React app available to us now. basically formatted and ready to go. If I were to run npm start, let's just make sure it's connected correctly. Awesome. So we can see here we have React up and running correctly. I am going to go ahead and get rid of this image and header because we're not going to need that for our application. So just to see if we can update this. There we go. So yeah, we just have a blank page now to start fresh. And I also want to go ahead and we'll get rid of this logo. Cool. So now that we have that taken care of, I think what we want to make sure is we also want to have a few things installed. I probably have these things installed already, but I'm just going to show you how to do it. We're going to want to make sure we have Redux, React Redux, and Redux Thunk. Redux Thunk is going to be especially important because we are going to fetch information from our back end to display on our front end, and Thunk is going to be one of the things that allows us to do that. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's just do some npm installs here. We'll install Redux, and we're going to install React Redux. And then finally, we're going to install Redux Thunk. Awesome. So now we have basically everything we need to get started with our front end. So from here, what we're going to do is build out a store that will in the future contain all of our state that we want to have available to us to be able to kind of share information and be able to get the strings from the form and present it on the front end. So let's do that next. All right, so it's time to think about how we want to expand out our React application from here. And there's a lot of directions you could go. You could start creating components. You could start building out your actions and your reducers if you're going to use Redux like we're going to do. But I think for us, just sort of to make everything easy to follow along with, the best thing to do would be to configure our store. And our store is going to contain our state, and it will allow us to access it across all of our components. And that is super useful for an application like this. And I think, that's probably the best way to go. There's lots of other options beyond Redux. You could just make this a pure React app. But I'm gonna use Redux just because I think it's very useful in this situation, and I'm real comfortable with it. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get rid of this report web vitals. It's just messy. You can keep it if you want, but I just think it just creates a lot of just visual clutter. And if you think it's important for your application, absolutely go ahead and keep it. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to import provider from, I believe this is from React Redux. It's very easy to get tripped up between the React Redux node package and the just plain Redux node package, but I'll try to keep this all accurate. And if not, I'll go back and fix it later. Then what we're going to do is we're going to delete this react.strict mode. Now that we have this provider component from React Redux, we're going to wrap that around our app component. And what this is going to do is basically allow anything contained within our app component, which is basically all of our components, is going to have access to this store that we're going to create. So then I think the next thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and create our store. So in our source directory here, we're going to go ahead and create store.js. And I'm not actually going to do anything with this yet. We'll get there in just a second, but I'm going to import store from store.js. And then to give our provider access to the store, we're going to create a props called store and pass in that new store file that we have imported. Okay. So I know that I just said the word store a lot several times in a row, but I promise you it's not going to end anytime soon, but we will get there eventually. So now now that we have everything set up in our index.js file here, let's go ahead and set up store.js. So again, this is where we're actually going to store our state data. And we need to be able to basically have a place where we can keep all of our reducers that we're going to be building. And that's going to require a bunch of different methods and functions from the Redux package manager. So let's go ahead and grab this. So we want create store. This is a deprecated action, I think, but you can still use it for now. You may want to look into better options than create store, but this is something that you can still use. It still works, at least for our purposes. Then we're going to get apply middleware. We're going to get compose, and we're going to get combine reducers, which is probably the most important one here, but they're all important. They're all special to me. So let's go ahead and import that. We also are going to want to import thunk, not think, thunk, from Redux. Very cool. So those are sort of the primary things we're going to want to have imported. So those are sort of the primary things we're going to want to have imported at this point. So after that, I actually am going to make a little note here with comments that I'm going to put any imported reducers here later. We haven't built any reducers yet, so I'm not quite at that point, but I want to have at least like a section where I know that's where any of the reducers we need, they're going to go there. And then we're going to set up a variable, a constant. We'll call that reducers. And we're going to use this combine reducers function that we got above. And for right now, we're going to leave this empty, but anytime we have something that's any kind of state that we build out across all of our components that we want to have access to, we can put that reducer for that state in here, and it'll make it available across every single one of our components. But we don't have any reducers yet, so let's hold off on that. Then below that, we're going to put our compose enhancer. Now, the thing this is going to do more than anything is actually it might not be super useful for you if you don't have it available to you, but I have the Redux Chrome extension that allows me to kind of look through and see state very easily. I find it very useful. So I'm basically using this to connect the Redux DevTools to this particular project. So you can take or leave this, but you're probably, I think it's worth at least trying out. If you haven't used Redux DevTools, very, very useful when developing a product with React and Redux. And then we're also going to put compose in here. All right. Now that we have that, we're going to build out our store, which will be another constant. We're going to use create store. Do this. We're going to pass in our reducers. We're going to pass in our compose enhancer. And then within compose enhancer, we're going to put apply middleware and thunk. Now, I know this kind of looks confusing right now. This is not like the most fun we're going to have coding this particular application, but this is all very important, I think, as a baseline to get set up if you're going to use Redux with the rest of the React application. This is very essential. So we're going to go ahead and export this default store. And now we are done. We have our store set up and configured. That will then be passed down as props throughout the rest of our application. And we can use any state that we put within store, specifically within this reducer section here. Any state reducer that we put in this constant will be available throughout the rest of the application. So with that done, I think it's time to start thinking about our components and what we actually want things to look like. With our store configured, I think it's time to really start thinking about what we want the site to look like. And so we already have an example here. Our application should have some sort of basic instructions, maybe like a title up here. And then we want a form where the user can enter their address. And I think this is kind of the first important thing we need to build out. So let's go ahead and build like a search bar component. And I think to start, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a few folders. Because we're using Redux, we are going to need some reducers as well as some actions. So I think we're going to create a components folder for all of our components. We're going to create an actions folder, and then we're also going to create a reducers folder. Awesome. So let's go ahead and stub out a very basic search bar component. So let's see, we're going to want to import React. Then we're going to create a constant. We're going to do this. I always prefer using functional components wherever possible, just a little bit smoother looking. So we're going to create a constant called search bar. Not going to pass anything into it at this point, but we're going to go ahead and open up those curly brackets. We're going to export default search bar for now. This might change later on, but I think that's what we're going to stick with, at least just to kind of get the sort of skeleton of this search bar out. Then we're going to want to return a div, and in that div, we're going to want to create a form. And then we'll just go ahead and create our inputs. So the first input will be type text, and maybe have like some placeholder text in there. Maybe just say like your address here. And then we probably also want some kind of like submit button with a value of submit. Cool. So in order to render this, what we need to do is we need to go back to our app component here, and we're going to import search bar from components. Awesome. And then in here in the app div, we can go ahead and render our search bar. So this isn't actually going to do anything yet, but it is going to at least give us an idea that we're kind of moving in the right direction. So let's go back. Actually, I'm going to delete this. Let's run a server, npm start. I'm going to do like a build here just to kind of see if that form is going to display. Oh, combined reducer is not defined. Very interesting. Okay, so this is probably going to help us out. Let's go to store.js. I think it should be combined reducers here. I think I misspelled that. Cool. So you can see here, we have a form ready to go. It's kind of tiny up here. It's not that big, but it will definitely suit our purposes. If we were to say, for example, enter an address, it's not going to do anything yet, right? We were to submit, it's just going to clear out. So what we want to do next is we want a way to grab the value of this form and then set state with it. So we want to be able to set like maybe like a state, we'll call it like either search results or district or something like that. We want to be able to set the state using whatever is submitted. So I think that's probably the next thing we want to do. And in order to do that, we're going to need to create a reducer and some actions. So let's go ahead and create some files here. We're going to create a search reducer. And we're also going to create a set of actions, which we'll just call search. Awesome. So I think for our search reducer, we're going to want to create another constant. We'll just call it search reducer just to make it nice and easy, nice and clean. And then we're going to pass in and sort of set initially a sort of blank state. And then we're also going to pass in an action, which is going to come from the search actions file that we've created already. And then this will be a function. So with that set up, and we also want to make sure that we export this. We're going to export as search reducer. Then we can create a couple of cases here. I think really what we want mostly is to update our search form. So when we click submit, we want whatever is in our form up here, we want that to be sent to state, right? So what we're going to have here is a switch, the action.type, and then we will have a case that we'll call update search form. Remember to have your cases in all uppercase. That's important. And then with this, we're just going to go ahead and return an action. And I guess sort of when we create that action, we're going to be passing in our search data. So we have to remember this for when we're building out our actions, but we'll call this search data here. And then this default will be return state. So if we don't have the update search form case, the default will just be to return this empty state that we have up here. Awesome. Then what we need is we need to go ahead and set up that action as we just mentioned. And I think the best way to do that would be to do just a, actually, I guess we want to keep the kind of format the same. So we'll export that further down below. We'll create an update search form action in which what we're going to pass in is our search data. And that's where we're going to get that search data in our reducer. That's where that's coming from. And then we are going to want to return a type update search form. And then we'll pass in the search data here. And this should, if everything goes well, allow us to update our search form when we click submit. So then we can make sure to export this. I just want to make sure I got that case right. I don't know why I thought maybe this was update search data. Let's just double check that. Okay, yeah, so everything's accurate there. Now, before we go ahead and start building out a function in our component to actually call this action and set our state, I think we're going to want to go back to our store. We're actually going to want to go ahead and pass in this reducer so that we have access to it throughout the application. So let's go ahead and we'll import. Why can't I spell today? We will import, we'll say search reducer from, oh no, we don't, is that what we want? Do we want search reducer? Yeah, we want search reducer. So we want to import search reducer from reducers, search reducer. And then we're just going to pass that in down here. Into our combine reducers function. And that should get us all connected so that once we have a function to actually set the state, we should see that reflected. And I'm going to use the dev tools that I set up earlier to do that. So let's go ahead next. Now that we have our search action, our search reducers, we've got a base component. Let's go ahead and actually create some functions within this component that will allow us to grab the data from the form. So now that we have our state available to us across the application, we have this search reducer, which we can call and it will give us our state. I think what we want to do is we want to build something in our search bar component that will allow us, if we kind of look at what we have so far, to enter an address here. So for example, we already have 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. We could then hit submit. And then what we want is to collect that information from the form and have that update our state so that that can now be what's reflected in the search reducer. And then we'll be able to use that when we're actually trying to display that information later on, or in this case, we want to actually send it to the Geocodio API. So to do that, I think we probably want some kind of function that will allow us to make this kind of submit. So let's go ahead and just sort of kind of stub this out a little bit. We want something that's, maybe call it handle submit. And we're going to pass in an event here because the event will allow us to grab the data that we get from our form. And we're just going to keep this empty for the moment. And then what we'll end up doing is in our form object here, we'll use the onSubmit trigger. And then when we hit the submit button, so onSubmit, we're going to call handle submit. Now, we've got a lot more work to do here. So what we really want, right? We want to be able to update our search reducer on submit. So we need this action that we created last time in update search form. And then we want to be able to pass in search data. And this search data we're going to get from that event, right? So I think that's probably the first place to start. So we need access to this update search form action. So let's go ahead and we'll go, oh, that's not where I want to go. Let's go to search bar. We're going to want to import connect from React Redux. I believe that's where we want to get it from. And then we're also going to want to import. I think we want to import, we don't need the curly brackets in this case. Maybe we do. That might actually make this a little bit easier. We want to import update search form from actions search. Okay. So that should give us the information that we need. So in order to actually be able to use this update search form, we're going to need to connect it to our component here. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to do a connect. And then we're going to wrap this in parentheses. And then in front of that, we're going to write some code here. Now, this is where we would actually put map state to props, but we don't have that yet. We will get there in a moment. We're just going to put null here for now. And then we're going to pass in update search form here so that we have access to it in our code. So now we should be able to use this action. So we probably then want to also pass it into our search bar. Cool. Now, we haven't called that yet, but we will in a moment. So I think probably the first thing we want to do within our handle submit is a prevent default. And then we want to find a way to actually grab the information from this event here. So let's actually throw a debugger in here so we can kind of see what this looks like when we actually click this submit button, right? So if we were to try to grab this information, what's going to happen when we hit debugger. So we do hit our debugger. That's good. So let's go to our console and let's kind of play around with the data a little bit so you can see what we're actually going to get. So what do we get if we call that event? Got it. So this is our onSubmit event. And what would event, I think you're going to see kind of here, if we open this up, there is an event target, which is a form. So that's what we want. We want our form. So let's try doing event.target. And that gives us our form. And we have a couple different inputs in that form. We have input text, and we also have the submit button. So if we try to just select the text that we want, this will give us that specific input. And then we just need that value. Awesome. So now when we enter text, event.target.value is going to give us whatever is in this text input. So I'm going to copy and paste that, and we're going to create some kind of constant here. We'll call this maybe search value. And then we'll just grab that value from the target. Awesome. And now, since we have update search form, when we call handle submit, after we've gotten our search value, we want to update search form, and then we want to pass in our search data, which in this case will be search value. Awesome. So if we've done all this correctly, which hopefully we have, we should now be able to see this change in real time. So let's go ahead and refresh our app here. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull up my, I think there's a Redux. Yeah, this is my Redux Chrome extension. I would definitely highly suggest this if you're using Redux. You can see a lot of information that's super helpful here. So let's go ahead and see what happens on submit. Awesome. Submit. All right, we didn't get anything there. That's kind of interesting. Well, let's check out the React components just to see. Okay, so search bar. No state there. Okay. Interesting. So we've kind of got to figure out why we didn't get any information there. So let's go ahead and see if we can. Let's console log our. Actually, let's do a debugger again. Do a debugger here. Save that. And what happens when we try to do this again? Cool. Let's go to our console. We've got a type error. The update search form is not a function. Okay. Let's see why that might be. What is update search form for us then? We passed it in. Update search form is not defined. Interesting. I wonder why that is. Let's try. I don't think this should be an issue, but let's add the .js in front of this. See if maybe that's creating a problem here. All right, let's see. So we've got that. Now, I guess let's see what our search value is. See if we're even getting the search value that we want. Okay, so we are getting that. And so let's see, what is props, maybe? Oh, not props. Every once in a while, it'll do this. Props is not defined. What is this? Undefined. Okay. What is, let's see here. What is, so it's not this search issue. Maybe, you know what it is? It might be that this needs to be destructured as well. Maybe if I pass it in like this, that might be the problem. Let's see. So let me go ahead. I'm actually going to start up my server and again, just to kind of give the browser a chance to kind of refresh and try things newly. All right, let's see. You're going to get tired of the address of the White House after a while on this one. Okay, we've got our submit. Okay, let's see if update search form now comes up. Still doesn't want to do it. Okay, what about search value? Is it still working? Okay, interesting. All right, so let's see if maybe, let's take this debugger out. I'm just going to try to pass in update search form search value one more time. So I'm going to close off each of these. Okay. Let's take a peek one more time. Let's see if we can get this working. All right, where is my Redux component here? Aha, okay, so I think we've got something. So I think it must have been that. We needed to make sure that we were using destructuring to pass in this update search form. So now let's try to do a different address. Let's, I always forget what it is. What's the Empire State Building's address? Let's see. 20th West 34th Street. All right, let's give it a shot. Submit. There we go. So we can see that now that we have updated our state, whenever we hit submit, we're actually able to see that in this Redux Chrome extension and really see kind of in real time that we're able to get this data. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an address. Obviously, that's what we want for the most part. But if I just said hello, we capture that. So yeah, we've got our first function up and running. And then what we want to do after this is we want to actually be able to find a way to then take this information that we're adding to state in our search reducer, and we want to send it to our backend. And this is really the crucial part here. So I'm going to go ahead and put this code up on screen for you so you can see it real quick in case you want to take any of this down. But yeah, so I think the next step for us is to figure out the best possible way to send this form information to our backend, and then basically plug that in to the Rails library, where we can then sort of send that information out to the API, get a response, and then whatever response we can get, we can use to create some new components that will render that data for the user. So before we get started with next steps, I want to go back a little bit because I made a mistake that I want to correct. And just in case you're following along, I don't want you to run into this as well. So basically, what I noticed was that when I was running my front end server, I was still running it on a 3000 node, basically meaning that if I were to run my front end and my back end at the same time, the browser is going to get confused as to which one to run because they're both running on localhost 3000. They were using the same port. And we definitely don't want that because we're going to need both of those to run at the same time to be able to test this out later. So I went into my package JSON, and just to kind of show you what I did, I went to my scripts, JavaScript objects here, and then into start. And that will then allow you to enter port equals 3001 into this string here. And what's really cool is once you've done that, when you run npm start and pull up your server again, you're going to get localhost 3001 instead. So that's super useful if you need to change the port for your sort of local browser. So just kind of something to update. But now that we've got that taken care of, it's not going to be immediately pressing, but it will be something that we have to deal with in a little bit. So let's go ahead back to our search bar component. And what I think we want is we want to be able to basically send this information that we now have saved into our search state. We want to be able to send that over to our backend, and we want to be able to pass that in right here into our .geocode function or method. And we want to be able to pass that information in here, and then basically get back whichever address the user enters. So I think something that we're going to need in order to be able to do that is we're going to need some other state, right? We have our search state, but we want to make sure that that's sort of maintained as just whatever has been submitted into our form here. We don't want to use that for everything. We're also going to need some kind of state component that contains whatever object is sent back to us once the API is called. So we haven't called the API yet, but I think it's a good idea to start thinking about what will happen when that does occur. So let's go ahead and we'll actually create a new reducer. And I think it will be appropriate, since we're going to be getting a response of like congressional districts, I think it would be appropriate to call this a district reducer. And we'll set this up. This is going to be very similar to what we did with the search reducer. So if you've seen that, you kind of know what's coming. We're going to create this constant called district reducer. We're going to pass in empty state as well as action. And then inside here, we're going to use a switch. And we're going to pass in action dot type. We're going to create a case, and we'll call this case set district. Make sure that's all uppercase there. And that's going to return a district from our action, from the set district action, which we're going to create in just a minute here. And then our default is just going to be that empty state. And then we want to make sure we also export this so that we can use it in some of our other files. Probably export default. Awesome. Then now, since we have this action, we want to make sure we set that up as well. So we want some sort of set district action. So we'll go ahead and do that. We need a new file. We'll call this district.js. And then this will have, we want to make sure we export this. We made that mistake with the search actions. So let's go ahead and export a constant called set district, and which we're going to pass in a district that we get back from our API. And we'll then return the type of set district, the case we just created, and then that district. Awesome. So now that we've got all that taken care of, let's go ahead and pass this new reducer into our combined reducers function in our store. That way we have access to it. And once we have this set up, now we've got that district reducer that should be reflected now if we go into that Redux store again. Let's go to our developer tools. And we can see now, yeah, so we have a search reducer and a district reducer. So cool. We've got what we need. So in our search bar component, we want to go ahead and set this up so that we have access to that action as well. We won't need it quite yet, but we will very shortly. So let's go ahead and do that for ourselves. Go ahead and set district. We'll fill that all the way up. Yep, there we go. From actions/district.js. And then I think we probably want to then also connect that up to our component. And we're probably going to want to also pass that into our search bar. Cool. So again, we haven't actually used this yet. And we can't really test it until we actually get a response back from the API. But I think that's the next thing that we're going to want to do. And we'll talk about that as soon as we come back. This is where the kind of tricky part comes in, right? We want to think about, how do we want to call the API? We have it set up. How do we want to actually call it? And we need a way to be able to send the information from our form to our Rails backend. And so we're going to use some kind of fetch, but the question kind of becomes, how do we want to actually set that up? When do we want to call fetch? And I think the best answer for this, at least for our purposes right now, is we want to call fetch anytime the browser re-renders. So anytime we submit a form, the browser is going to re-render. So we want to make sure that we're sending any new information in that search form to our API at that point. I think that's a good place to do it, and a good tool with which to be able to make a change or to run a function anytime your browser re-renders is to use this awesome React hook called use effect. And we'll grab that from React. We want to make sure we have that. Then we also want to go ahead and get that sort of set up for ourselves. So we are going to say, we'll use effect here. Set up this function. So we want to basically call some sort of function at this point where it will make this fetch request for us to our backend. So let's create a constant. We'll call it fetch district, which we'll sort of run a little bit later on. Fetch district is going to do basically one thing for us. We're going to make a fetch request, and we're going to fetch from, I think it's going to be our local host 3000. And then we want to get districts. But then beyond just calling our sort of get districts action here from our districts controller, we don't just want that, because then all that's going to do right now is it's just going to fetch this information about this hard-coded data. We actually want to send this data out as well. So we actually probably want to basically search, which, let me make sure that we're doing this correctly here. Yeah, we want to like send a prop down basically. So we're going to create a prop called search. And with that, we're going to send in our search data. We don't actually have that right now, right? Like this is a bit of a problem for us. We don't actually have the search data. So I'm going to make sure we're sort of doing this correctly here. You want to make sure, don't do what I just did. You want to actually use backticks instead of sort of your standard quotation marks if you're going to be interpolating like this. So we're going to send in this search information, but we don't actually have that right now, right? Like we haven't grabbed that anywhere. So how do we do that, right? We want to map our state to props so that then we can call that state in as props into our component here. So let's create a new object down here. I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier. We're going to create a constant called map state to props. And then we're going to pass in our state. And then we're going to return a couple different things. We're going to return our state.search reducer, which we have already. And we're also going to return our state.district reducer, because we're going to need that as well further down the line. But I'm just going to choose to rename these because search reducer and district reducer is a little bit wonky to constantly have to call. So I'm going to call this search, and I'm going to call this district. Awesome. So we have our map state to props, and then we're going to pass that in right here into connect where this null is. So now our state is going to be available to us as props. So we don't have that yet, right? It's still saying that search is undefined, that we're passing into that fetch. So we want to go up and we want to actually pass in our search props. And the way I like to do it, and you can kind of do this however you want, I like to put my props first when I'm passing them in to my component, and then any actions after the props, but you can kind of format however you like. So now you can see search lit up. So we're now going to get that search data from our application here. So whatever our search reducer is, our state for search is going to be passed in as a props called search. That's going to then be sent over to our controller, and we're going to create some new information in here, build out some extra code that will allow us to actually pass in those props. But before we do that, I'm going to create what I think I want this to behave like. It might not work correctly the first time, but I think I have a general idea of what I want. So I want to make sure that since that we're basically trying to get information back, I want this to be get request. And I also want some headers in there because I want JSON returned to us. We'll say content type is going to be application JSON. Very cool. Then I want to get whatever data that is, whatever response we get. So that's our response. And I want to convert it into JSON. And then once that's through, and this is like really thinking a little bit ahead because we haven't tested any of this yet. So I might end up having to delete some of it to test it. But I just kind of want to get the theoreticals out there. If this works correctly, we're going to be sending in the address from our search bar into that fetch. We're going to get that fetch request out to the backend. It's going to respond. Then it's going to take that response, convert it to JSON so that we can use it. And then once we have that, we're going to take whatever data we get back. And if there's an error, right, then we're going to respond with just like a console log that basically just says something went wrong. But if there is no error else, then we're going to use this set district state that we just created, this action rather. We're going to use set district, and we're going to pass in that data. So what is that going to do for us? It basically means that if everything goes as planned, if we don't get any errors, then when we sort of successfully call our fetch district function that we have here, we're then going to, at the end of everything, set the district with the data that we're getting back from the API, right? That's the core of all of this. We want to get that data back from the API using the search information that we're passing in. So there's a lot more to this that we still need to do to be able to get this all up and running. But this is a really good base for where we need to get started. So I think what we probably want to do then is go back to our backend. We want to go back to Rails, and we want to make sure that we're actually able to get this search information in Rails to pass in to our Rails library and get a response from the Geocodio API. Okay, so my original intention with this video was to wrap everything up in part 2, to show you everything you needed to know to have a completely working application by the end of this video. But unfortunately, I think things have kind of gotten a little bit far ahead of me. This video has gotten a little bit long, and I want to make sure that I'm not overwhelming you or overloading your head with information. So I think now is a really good time to take a break. Instead of doing 2 parts, we're going to split this up into 3 parts. And basically what we're going to do is in part 3, we're going to continue doing what we've been so far in this video. You know, in the first video, we talked about Rails and how to build out our backend. In this video, we talked about React and how to sort of start setting up our front end. And then in our third video, I really want to finish everything up. I'm going to show you how that Geocodio API is a bridge between our front end and our back end. And we're going to make sure everything is integrated nice. And then we're going to style everything, make it look pretty so that by the end of this whole experience, you have a complete example of how to integrate Geocodio into your own applications. So I really hope you will join me for part 3. We're getting there. We're almost done. And I think you'll really like the final results once we get to the end. So please jump over to that video. And I can't wait. It's going to be a really good time. And if you want to sort of take some time in between, feel free to check out Geocodio. You can try it for free on your own and see if it be something that would fit your needs. Can't wait till part 3. See you soon.